What does it take for a child to vanish without a trace? Is it a cruel twist of fate, or something far more deliberate? Something born out of darkness hiding in plain sight? In the spring of 1898, the quiet town of Springfield, Vermont, was the kind of place where nothing terrible ever seemed to happen. Families left their doors unlocked. Neighbors gathered on porches at dusk, and children played along the dusty roads until the evening light faded. But that sense of safety would soon shatter because of one little girl. Her name was Alice Meaker. She was only 12 years old, a bright, curious child with dark hair and a shy smile that everyone in town seemed to know. To most, she was simply a sweet girl who loved to help her mother around the house and spent hours wandering the nearby riverbank, sketching flowers and chasing dragonflies. But what no one realized was that Alice's innocent world was about to collide with something unthinkable. On the evening of March 4th, 1898, Alice left her home just before dusk. She told her mother she'd be back before dark. She never returned. At first, no one panicked. In a small town like Springfield, children often lost track of time. But when night fell, and the lamps in every window were lit, fear began to creep in. Search parties were formed. Torches flickered through the woods, and voices called her name into the cold night air. Yet the silence that answered was deafening. Days passed. The river was searched. Barns were checked. Every corner of town turned upside down, but Alice was gone. Then, a chilling discovery changed everything. A bundle of clothing was found near the water's edge, torn, blood-stained, and half buried in mud. The sight of it silenced the crowd gathered by the river. A mother's scream cut through the air. The nightmare everyone had been trying to ignore had become terrifyingly real. Newspapers across New England soon carried the story of the disappearance of little Alice Meaker, calling it one of the most haunting child mysteries Vermont had ever seen. But what really happened to Alice that night? Was she lured away by a stranger or by someone she trusted? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, why did some people in Springfield seem so desperate to move on, as if forgetting was easier than finding the truth? Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't about monsters in the dark. They're about the people who walk among us, pretending to care. Before her name became a headline, Alice Meaker was simply a child, full of life, imagination, and wonder. She was born in the small town of Springfield, Vermont, to a modest working family who lived on the outskirts of town. Her father, James Meaker, worked at the local mill, often gone before sunrise and home long after dark. Her mother, Clara, kept the house running, tending to the garden, sewing clothes, and raising Alice and her younger brother Samuel. Neighbors remembered the Meakers as quiet but respectable. They weren't wealthy, but their home was always tidy. Their small front porch lined with flower pots, Alice had helped paint herself. She was always humming, one neighbor later told a reporter. You could hear her from the lane, that little voice, singing to herself while she swept the steps. There wasn't a mean bone in that child's body. Alice was known in town for her curiosity. She loved collecting smooth stones by the river and sketching tiny creatures she found along the bank. Teachers described her as bright, though shy, the kind of child who'd rather listen than speak. She was fascinated by stories, old ghost tales, myths, and adventure books, and often borrowed worn volumes from the church library. Reading them by lamplight when she thought her parents were asleep, her mother would later recall. With tears in her eyes, how Alice dreamed of becoming a teacher one day. She wanted to help other children read, she said softly. She said books made her feel less alone. Life in Springfield was simple then. Days began with the chime of the mill bell and ended with the hum of crickets beyond the fields. The Meakers had little, but they had enough. And in a world that moved slowly and quietly, that was all most people asked for. But beneath that calm rhythm, Small-town life carried its shadows. People talked. Rumors spread like smoke. And even a child's actions could be watched and judged. Some said Alice was too trusting, that she'd stop to talk with anyone who smiled her way. Others whispered that she had been seen walking with a woman from another town, someone no one seemed to know much about. Friends remembered her as gentle. The local paper would later write, but not naive, a girl who saw good in everyone, even when she shouldn't have. Alice's closest friend, Maggie Carter, was the same age. In her later testimony, she recalled the last day she saw Alice. We were walking home from school. She told me she was going to help someone after supper. I asked who, but she didn't say. She just smiled, that little smile she always had, and said, "It's a secret." Then she waved and went down the lane. That was the last time I ever saw her. Those words would haunt Maggie for the rest of her life. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize the simplicity of those years, a time before the world felt dangerous. But the truth is, even in the quietest places, darkness can find its way in. And for a 12-year-old girl like Alice, it came quietly, through the trust she placed in the wrong person. Her story isn't just one of tragedy. It's a reminder of how fragile innocence truly is. Because when we think of unsolved mysteries and haunting crimes, we often picture adults caught in conflict. But when the victim is a child, the loss feels heavier, as if the world itself failed to protect something pure. And in the case of Alice Meaker, that loss still echoes, over a century later. It was Saturday, March 4th, 1898, a gray, windless day in Springfield, Vermont. The town woke slowly under a pale sky, the sound of the mill in the distance blending with the calls of crows circling above the frozen river. Inside the Meaker home, the smell of wood smoke lingered as Clara Meaker prepared breakfast for her 2 children. Alice was up early that morning, as she always was. She'd helped her mother sweep the hearth and feed the chickens before sitting by the window to watch the world wake up. She was in good spirits, Clara later recalled. Quiet, but happy. She'd been talking about spring, how she couldn't wait to see the flowers bloom again. By mid-morning, Alice walked with her younger brother Samuel to fetch water from the pump near the edge of the property. Along the way, she picked up small pebbles from the thawing ground, humming softly to herself. To anyone who saw her that day, she seemed perfectly ordinary, just another child enjoying a chilly March morning. But sometime after lunch, something changed. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, a neighbor named Mrs. Harlow saw Alice standing by the fence that bordered the old mill road. She appeared to be speaking with someone, an adult, though Mrs. Harlow couldn't make out who it was. I thought it strange, she would later tell police, because the person with her wasn't anyone I recognized from town. When questioned further, Mrs. Harlow described the stranger as a woman, tall, dressed in dark clothing, and wearing a bonnet that hid her face. Alice seemed comfortable, even smiling. The two walked down the path together, toward the woods near the river. That was the last confirmed sighting of Alice Meaker alive. By supper time, Clara began to worry. The sun had dipped below the hills, and the sky was quickly fading to indigo. Alice had promised to be home before dark, yet her place at the table sat empty. At first, Clara assumed her daughter had lost track of time, maybe stopped at a friend's house. But as the minutes turned into hours, her unease grew into panic. James Meaker returned home from the mill just after 7 p.m. When he learned Alice hadn't come back, he immediately grabbed a lantern and set off into the night, calling her name along the familiar roads. Neighbors soon joined him, their voices echoing across the dark fields. "Alice!" They shouted into the wind, but only silence answered back. The search continued well into the night. The flicker of lanterns cut through the fog that hung low over the fields, and the rhythmic sound of boots in mud carried through the stillness. They searched the riverbank, the abandoned barns, the thickets behind the churchyard. Anywhere a child might have wandered. But no one found a trace of her. It wasn't until the next morning that the first clue surfaced. Near the bend of the river, just past the old footbridge, a small ribbon was found snagged on a low branch. It was blue, the same color Alice's mother had tied into her daughter's hair that morning. Beneath it, faint footprints led toward the water, and then stopped. Could anyone have predicted what was about to happen? Could a simple walk in the afternoon end in tragedy? Or was this something premeditated, something far darker than anyone in that town wanted to believe? By the time the sun rose again, fear had begun to settle over Springfield. The laughter of children faded from the streets, replaced by the low murmur of worry and suspicion. Because in a town where everyone thought they knew each other, the realization was beginning to sink in. Someone among them knew exactly what had happened to Alice Meaker. For 2 days, Springfield was consumed by the search for 12-year-old Alice Meaker. Her name was on every tongue, whispered in kitchens, shouted across fields, and prayed over in quiet church pews. The once peaceful town had been transformed overnight into a landscape of fear and frantic motion. By the third morning, the volunteers who had combed the woods were exhausted but unwilling to stop. Men brought their hounds, women packed bread and coffee for the search parties, and children were kept indoors. It seemed impossible that a little girl could simply vanish in a town so small, where every road, every tree, and every field was known by heart. Then, in the pale dawn light of March 7th, a chilling discovery was made. Just a mile beyond the Meaker home, at the edge of Black Brook, a farmer named Thomas Reed noticed something half buried in the snow near the water's edge. At first, he thought it was fabric, a piece of clothing caught on the reeds. But when he stepped closer, his stomach turned. It was a child's dress, soaked and torn, lying beside a small, muddied shoe. Reed didn't touch a thing. He ran straight to town, his voice breaking as he told the constable what he'd found. Within an hour, Sheriff Milton Crane and his men had arrived at the scene. They followed the faint trail of footprints, small, uneven, that led toward the brook and disappeared into the icy water. Searchers waded in, breaking through thin layers of ice, and within minutes one of them called out when they lifted Alice's small body from the water. The world seemed to go silent. She was still wearing her faded wool coat, one ribbon still tied loosely in her hair. Her hands were folded close to her chest, as if she'd tried to protect herself from the cold. The coroner's examination would later reveal bruising on her wrists and marks on her neck, evidence that this had not been an accident. Word of the discovery spread faster than the sheriff could contain it. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the Meaker home. Clara collapsed upon hearing the news, her cries echoing down the road. Neighbors stood by in stunned silence, many of them weeping openly. The town that once felt safe, one newspaper later wrote, was now cloaked in fear. For the first time in living memory, people in Springfield began locking their doors at night. Parents refused to let their children walk alone, even in daylight. And suspicion, that poisonous whisper, began to ripple through the town. Who could have done such a thing? Some believed it had to be a stranger, someone passing through. Others weren't so sure. Rumors began to circle about a woman seen near Mill Road the day Alice vanished, tall, dressed in black. The same woman Mrs. Harlow had mentioned. But no one could name her. No one could even say where she'd come from. Sheriff Crane organized an investigation that stretched over weeks. The Vermont State Police were brought in, though their resources were limited. Posters went up in nearby towns, offering a small reward for any information. Dozens were questioned, farmhands, mill workers, peddlers, yet every lead dissolved into nothing. The papers took the story and ran with it. Headlines like "Springfield Child Found Dead, Murder Suspected, and the Monster Among Us." Sold by the thousands, reporters from Boston and New York arrived, eager to turn the quiet tragedy into a spectacle. They printed exaggerated tales about ghostly figures in the woods and curses tied to the river. The facts became blurred with rumor, and before long, Alice's death was no longer just a local tragedy. It was a national mystery. But behind the sensational headlines, the Meaker family was left to live with the unbearable silence that followed. Clara rarely spoke after the funeral. She would sit for hours by the window, staring toward the woods, waiting for a daughter who would never come home. James threw himself into work, returning late each night, his hands raw from labor, but his mind elsewhere. Samuel, Alice's younger brother, was said to have nightmares for years, dreams of his sister standing by the river, her ribbon fluttering in the wind. Despite the efforts of police, no arrests were ever made. The case slowly went cold, buried beneath newer stories and changing times. Still, even decades later, older residents of Springfield spoke of that winter as a turning point, the moment innocence was lost. Before Alice, the town had been open, trusting. After her death, something inside it changed forever. Because sometimes it's not just the loss of a child that haunts a place. It's the unanswered questions that follow. The discovery of Alice Meaker's body marked the beginning of one of the most haunting investigations in Vermont's early 1900s history. Sheriff Milton Crane, a man known for his quiet determination, swore publicly that he would find the one who did this, no matter how long it took. But even he could not have known just how tangled the path ahead would become. At first, the sheriff's team focused on what little evidence the scene offered. The icy water had washed away most traces, but a few details stood out. There were clear signs of a struggle near the riverbank, broken twigs, a patch of disturbed earth, and footprints leading toward the brook. They appeared to belong to both an adult and a child. The adult prints were larger, heavier, and trailed off into the distance. Alice's coat was buttoned wrong, right over left, something her mother swore she never did herself. That detail, small as it was, struck investigators as chilling. It meant someone else had redressed her after death. The coroner's report was equally unsettling. Alice had not drowned. She'd been strangled. Bruises along her wrists and neck confirmed it. Whoever killed her had likely known her. She hadn't fought back until the very end. But who could possibly want to harm a 12-year-old child? The first suspect to draw attention was a local laborer named Henry Davis, a quiet man in his 30s who worked at the sawmill near the river. Several witnesses recalled seeing him walking along Mill Road the day Alice disappeared. Davis was known to keep to himself, and his solitary nature made him an easy target for suspicion. When questioned, he claimed he'd been fishing that afternoon, alone. Police searched his home and found nothing linking him to the crime. No torn fabric, no traces of blood. Still, in a town desperate for answers, rumors grew quickly. Parents whispered that Davis had always been odd, that he lingered near the schoolhouse more than a grown man should. But the sheriff wasn't satisfied with whispers. He needed facts, and none pointed decisively to Davis. After days of scrutiny, he was quietly released. The town's anger, however, didn't fade so easily. For weeks afterward, Davis was shunned in public, his reputation destroyed by a crime he was never charged with. Another lead surfaced, one that seemed, for a time, far more promising. A traveling salesman by the name of Charles Grant had passed through Springfield 2 days before Alice vanished. He was staying at the local inn, and the innkeeper's wife claimed she saw him talking to a young girl outside the general store. Grant left town the next morning, supposedly bound for Montpelier. Sheriff Crane telegraphed the authorities there, who eventually tracked Grant down. When questioned, he admitted he had spoken briefly to a child, but only to ask for directions. He seemed genuinely shaken to learn she had been murdered. His accounts checked out. He'd been seen miles away by the time of Alice's disappearance, but the interaction still bothered investigators. What if Alice had trusted him enough to lead him somewhere? What if she'd gone willingly? For weeks, the investigation drifted between theories. Some said Alice had been lured by someone she knew. Others believed she had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have seen, a secret meeting, perhaps, or an illicit affair hidden in the woods. And then came the most unsettling rumor of all. A neighbor reported seeing Clara Meaker, Alice's own mother, arguing with a man near the woods the day before the disappearance. Some speculated it was her estranged cousin, a man named George, who had recently returned to town after years away. George had a reputation: drinking, gambling, a short temper, and when word reached him that he was being talked about, he vanished again. When police finally located him weeks later, living in a nearby township, he denied any involvement. But his nervous manner, coupled with inconsistencies in his story, made investigators wary. He claimed he hadn't seen Alice in months, yet a ribbon matching one of hers was found in his room. Tests in those days were primitive. There was no DNA, no forensic precision. The ribbon could have been coincidence, or something far darker. Still, despite their suspicions, there wasn't enough evidence to hold him. George walked free, and the case once again returned to silence. But even silence has a way of speaking. If one listens closely enough, over time, smaller details began to resurface. A farmer reported seeing lantern light near the brook the night before Alice's body was found. Another claimed he'd heard distant crying carried by the wind. None of it led anywhere solid, but each clue added another layer to the mystery. The police, exhausted and directionless, began to lose momentum. Without a confession or a clear suspect, they could only document what they had, a list of possibilities that led nowhere. And yet, one theory, whispered more than spoken, continued to haunt Springfield long after the official investigation had closed. Some believed Alice's death wasn't random at all. They claimed it was tied to an old family feud involving land and inheritance. The Meakers had once been close to another local family, the Harpers, who lived just beyond the woods. Decades earlier, a dispute over property lines had turned bitter. There were rumors of threats exchanged, of grudges that lingered through generations. Could Alice have been the unintended victim of a feud between adults? A tragic casualty of hatred that had nothing to do with her? It was a painful thought, one the community rarely spoke aloud, and yet, despite all these leads, the suspects questioned, the rumors explored. The endless nights Sheriff Crane spent at his desk. The case never moved beyond speculation. The sheriff would retire years later, still haunted by the Meaker file that sat unsolved in his cabinet. "I thought I'd have answers by now," he was quoted as saying. But the truth, the real truth, it's like smoke. Every time I reach for it, it slips away. Perhaps the most haunting part of the Alice Meaker case isn't who killed her, but how close the town seemed to come to understanding, only for certainty to vanish again and again, just beyond reach. And so the question still lingered. Did the evidence truly point to them? Or had the real killer walked away, unnoticed, into history? When the police finally arrested George Meaker, Alice's distant cousin, in the late autumn of 1903, the small Vermont town that had once been silent was suddenly roaring with speculation. The air was heavy with accusation, and in a place where everyone knew each other by name, rumors traveled faster than the truth ever could. The newspapers wasted no time. Headlines like "Family Betrayal," "The Meaker Tragedy Deepens," and "Was it blood that spoke, or madness?" appeared on front pages across the region. Reporters from Boston and New York came streaming into Springfield, notebooks in hand. Eager to turn a local tragedy into a national story, they painted the town as a shadowed, superstitious place, one where whispers of guilt carried more weight than evidence ever could. Illustrations of Alice's innocent face appeared beside grim sketches of George, his eyes shaded to appear almost villainous. The message was clear. The papers wanted a story, not necessarily the truth. But the reality was far less simple. George's trial began in the county courthouse that winter. The room was packed, not just with townspeople, but with strangers who had come from miles around, hungry to see the man accused of murdering a child. For days, the prosecution built its case on circumstantial threads. The ribbon found in his room, the alleged argument near the woods, his inconsistent statements. Yet for every claim made by the prosecution, the defense had an answer. The ribbon, they argued, was a common pattern, easily purchased in the general store. The argument witnessed by neighbors could never be confirmed. And George's disappearance, his lawyer insisted, was not flight from guilt, but fear. Fear of being accused of something he hadn't done. Still, the image painted by the press was impossible to erase. The more George denied his involvement, the guiltier he seemed in the public eye. Inside the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. Witness after witness took the stand. Townsfolk, factory workers, even children who had played with Alice. They all spoke of strange noises in the woods, of figures seen after dark, of a town too frightened to trust anyone anymore. But none could say with certainty that they had seen George that night. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury withdrew to deliberate. They were gone for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice trembled as he read the verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted, not in relief, but in outrage. Some gasped. Others wept. A few shouted that justice had failed. George, visibly shaken, was escorted out under guard as the crowd jeered. Though he was legally free, his life in Vermont was over. He would leave town within days, never to return. But the damage had already been done. The town of Springfield, once a place where children played freely and doors were left unlocked, had changed forever. Fear settled into its foundations. Parents no longer allowed their children to wander alone. Every unfamiliar face was a potential threat, and in the years that followed, the story of Alice Meaker's murder became less about evidence and more about legend. The newspapers had turned her death into a symbol of innocence lost, of small-town darkness, of a community that could not protect its own. In some ways, it was never really about Alice anymore. As one local columnist wrote years later, we buried more than a child that summer. We buried our sense of safety and perhaps even our belief in one another. Perhaps what shocked people most wasn't just the crime, but what it revealed about society at the time, a society eager for justice, but unprepared for uncertainty. In an era before forensic science, when truth depended on testimony and rumor, fear could decide fate far more swiftly than fact. The Meaker case became a cautionary tale, not just about violence, but about perception, about how easily truth could be distorted once a story left the courtroom and entered the headlines. In the decades that followed, ghost stories emerged around the brook where Alice was found. Some claimed to hear a child's laughter on cold nights. Others swore they'd seen a pale figure near the bridge, hair dripping as if fresh from the river. It was as though the town's guilt had taken on a life of its own, a haunting that refused to fade. The newspapers moved on. Of course, new scandals, new tragedies, new mysteries took their place. But in Springfield, the name Alice Meaker never disappeared. It lingered in hushed conversations, in old photographs tucked into drawers, in the uneasy silence of the woods that bordered the town, and for those who lived through it, those who remembered the trial, the shouting crowds, the flicker of lanterns outside the courthouse windows, the case remained unfinished. Justice had been spoken aloud, but few truly believed. It had been served. When the verdict was read and George Meaker walked free, Most in Springfield hoped that life would slowly return to normal. But the shadow that had fallen over the town didn't lift. The case may have been closed in the eyes of the law, but in the hearts of those who had lived through it, it never truly ended. As months turned to years, the memory of 12-year-old Alice Meaker refused to fade. Her name was etched into the town's collective memory, whispered by parents to children as both warning and prayer. Yet despite the trial, despite the newspaper headlines, one question lingered louder than all the rest. Who really killed Alice Meaker? Because the truth was, the evidence never fit together neatly. George's acquittal left a vacuum, one that rumor and speculation quickly filled. Some believed that he had indeed been guilty, that the jury's decision was swayed more by doubt than by innocence. Others were certain that he had been a scapegoat, an easy target for a community desperate to blame someone, anyone, for such an unspeakable act. There were other whispers, too, ones the newspapers never printed. Few locals insisted that a strange woman had been seen near Black Brook the day before Alice vanished, dressed in mourning black, carrying what looked like a bundle of clothes. She had reportedly asked for directions toward the Meaker farm and was never seen again. Some said she was a traveler. Others believed she might have been a former nurse who'd worked for the Meaker family years earlier, dismissed under mysterious circumstances. But no records of such a woman were ever found. Then there was the matter of the ribbon, the small, pink piece of fabric found near the scene. For decades, it remained a point of obsession among amateur investigators and locals alike. Some argued that it had been planted to frame George. Others thought it was Alice's own. But if so, why was it found so far from where she was discovered? Even modern experts who have revisited the case struggle to make sense of the inconsistencies. In the absence of hard evidence, no fingerprints, no autopsy photographs, no surviving reports, the Meaker case exists mostly through fragmented newspaper clippings and fading testimony. And those fragments tell a story both haunting and incomplete. Years later, a retired police officer who had grown up in Springfield claimed to have heard rumors within the department, rumors that a second suspect had once been quietly questioned. A man who had worked near the Meaker property doing odd jobs. According to this account, he had left town shortly after Alice's death. But without official records, it's impossible to know if this lead was ever real, or just another layer of myth added to the story over time. But perhaps the most chilling theory, one that surfaced decades later, was that Alice's death was the result of a secret kept within her own family. Some researchers have suggested that her disappearance may have been tied to long-standing tensions within the Meaker household, or that she had witnessed something she was never meant to see. Of course, there's no proof of this. Only fragments of gossip recorded long after the fact, when truth and rumor had long since blurred together. Still, it's this ambiguity that continues to draw people back to the story. Modern historians have tried to piece together timelines using census data, court transcripts, and archived local newspapers. Yet every attempt to form a clear narrative ends the same way, with missing pages, contradictory statements, and gaps too wide to fill. It's as though time itself conspired to erase the truth. Today, the site where Alice's body was found remains quiet. The old bridge has long since been replaced, and the brook runs clear again. But locals say that on cold March mornings, when the mist rolls low over the water, you can still feel something heavy in the air, a sadness that doesn't quite belong to the present. Some call it imagination. Others call it memory, and maybe that's what makes this story so haunting. The way it refuses to die. The way every theory, every retelling, feels like trying to trace a ghost's footsteps, always visible for a moment, then gone. More than a century later, the murder of Alice Meaker remains one of Vermont's oldest and most mysterious unsolved cases. No one was ever convicted. No confession was ever made. and no evidence has ever surfaced to point decisively to a killer. It's a story that lingers not because of what we know, but because of what we never will. And so, decades later, the truth remains just out of reach. And so we come to the end of the story of Alice Meaker, a 12-year-old girl whose life was full of promise, yet whose death left behind only shadows and silence. More than a century has passed since that cold March morning, but her name still carries a chill through the quiet fields of Vermont. Her story reminds us how fragile truth can be, how it can slip away, piece by piece, until all that remains are echoes of what might have been. Maybe someone out there still holds a fragment of the answer. Or maybe the truth was lost long ago, buried beneath time and fear. But one thing is certain. Some mysteries are never meant to fade. If you found this story as haunting as we did, consider subscribing for more quiet investigations into forgotten crimes and unsolved mysteries.